worried my brother's cancer's gotten worse. So.
Oh, I'm sorry to hear that.
Great day, right?
Yeah.
Well, he's probably going to die of the COVID, though. See. Anyways, well, there was something else.
One word in the chat, if everybody can share.
Yeah, I got you. Oh, great. It didn't go to chat. Okay, cool.
Okay. Great, and I've got tired but ready, curious, ready, busy, excited, vaccine soon. Excellent. All right, looking forward to the session. Hopeful, interested, drawn, pumped for science. Good. Okay. Excellent. Well, welcome everybody. It's great to see all of your faces. It's good to see your names, even if you're not sharing your faces. Absolutely. Great to see everybody, and welcome to the second learning session for the Washington Climate Assembly. Just a reminder that we are live streaming so that folks can follow along. And a quick reminder too, for everybody that is joining, first name, comma, location. And if you need help renaming yourself, we'll also do a scan and we'll be helping folks along the way as well. So great to see you all. Welcome. If you still want to share something in the chat about how you're feeling for folks that just joined us, please do so. And we do want to, we'll do a land acknowledgement at the beginning of every meeting. And so wish to acknowledge that the people of Washington State live and work on traditional lands of the indigenous people who've been here since time immemorial. There are 29 federally recognized tribes and 7 non-federally recognized tribes within the boundaries of Washington State. Tribes and tribal people bring thousands of years of traditional knowledge to our present moment, and tribes bring an important and vital voice to the current conversation, and we honor our tribal relations. And with that, quick reminder again for first name and location. If you are a presenter, if you could do your full name at comma presenter so that the assembly members know who you are. And quick also other Zoom reminders for the night, using your computer to connect with Zoom. And we will be using chat. We're going to be using chat a little differently than we did in previous meetings. And I'll go over that in just a moment. Using a headset or taking the call from a quiet space to reduce background noise. And then please keeping your phone or headset muted unless you're speaking to the group. Another reminder of our fearless tech leader, Brent Edgar. If one of my team members can add his contact info into the chat. If anything does happen, as we know, technology is great when it works and is less great when it doesn't. So if you do have an issue at any time throughout the evening, please don't hesitate to either send him an email if your tech is working, but maybe your audio isn't, or give him a call as well. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Mike, who's going to go over tonight's agenda.
Great, thanks, Gretchen. So welcome to the second learning session, everyone. So in just a moment, I'm going to review some of the take-home themes from our Saturday learning session, just to provide more touch points and reminders of what we heard and some of the take-home messages we hope we learn from each of these presentations. And I'm going to outline some of the context for today's presenters and the presentations we'll hear from as well. Our team in a moment will also provide a few ways that you can continue to provide important feedback about wanting to learn more about particular topics, sharing articles from your own research, our work, and providing general feedback on each of the learning sessions as well. We'll be pulling up the project website and orienting you to where you can provide this input as well in just a moment. We'll also introduce each of tonight's speakers. We've got 5 speakers for tonight, and we'll do a 30-second pause before, after each of the speakers to let you process and add questions to the chat. Our 5 speakers tonight are Dr. Amy Snover from the UW Climate Impacts Group, Dr. Chris Ebi from the University of Washington's Center for Health and the Global Environment, Dr. Claire Richards from Washington State University, Dr. Deb Morrison, also from the University of Washington, and Hester Cerebrin from Transportation Choices Coalition. Next slide, please, Wendy. So before we dive in, we wanted to provide an overview and another touch point of some of the take-home themes from the very first learning session we had on Friday. So Christine Yorgi, one of our experts, gave an introduction to climate mitigation, the greenhouse gas effect, and also communicated how those link to specific agricultural case studies that she worked in the community she works in Eastern Washington. We also heard from Preston Hardison, who spoke about the legal background for tribes and tribal sovereignty as it relates to natural resource management and climate change, and Shangri-La Joshi, talking about the ethics and responsibility for climate action. We also had various interested parties who presented local perspectives and efforts in the space that hopefully provides you some more context and spurs ideas for your own recommendations and ideas for climate action in the Washington state. And finally, we had Jennifer Atkinson presenting and hopefully equipping you with the skills, tools, and vocabulary around climate grief and anxiety, understanding that we're going to be learning a lot together over the next few weeks. So we just want to make sure that we're building skills collectively as well. Next slide, please. So here you can see where we're at in our learning sessions. We have 7 learning sessions, and today we're going to continue learning some of the foundations of climate change as beginning to learn what are some of the social issues and considerations when it comes to climate mitigation. Next slide, Wendy. Thank you. And so we have, like we said, multiple experts presenting on a diverse range of topics today. And so we wanted to outline some of the learning objectives that we want you to walk away and for you to think about when you hear some of these presentations today. We're going to talk about what are some of the causes of climate change, the impacts of climate change, and what are some of the social considerations of these climate impacts. So we'll hear from 3 experts around that. And then we'll also have other experts talking about the intersection of some of the foundations of the climate change and its science and how it relates to specific action and what that means. And so we have another expert talking about, again, the basics of climate change and linking that to educational opportunities in the state, and also thinking about climate action and transportation. I'll turn this back to Gretchen now. You're on mute, Gretchen. So.
I was on mute and I said all sorts of things to you all. So moving into the next agenda item, your feedback, your assembly. So we do have a few different avenues for you all to provide input. And so we wanted to walk through each of these because it really is important to hear from you all in various different ways if you have something you'd like to share. So for the first bullet, submitting questions to presenters. So there are 2 ways to submit questions to presenters. You can email us at the members@waclimateassembly.org, email in advance of any meeting, or you can write a question into chat at any time during any of the presentations. And when we get to that stage, I will go through kind of the same process that we used last time. We are going to be using chat exclusively for the purpose of asking questions this time versus sharing reflections. So that's one pivot that we're making that will be different than how we use chat on Saturday, because there will be plenty of time for you all to dive into, share your opinions about, share your reflections on each of the presenters, both at the end of each of our meetings and then also during the deliberative sessions as well. The next item here that you see, a deeper dive into any topic. So if you'd like to suggest a topic or dive more deeply into any particular topic, please share your input with us. And in just a moment, we are going to pivot really quickly over to the website to show you where on our website this lives. And then the next is independent research. So if any of you are inspired and are doing any independent research on your own, and there's something that you want to share related to an article that you read that you thought was really thought-provoking, or had some really good information that you thought other assembly members would like to see, then you can provide that input on the website, and we will include it in the distribution of meeting materials when it goes out. And then general feedback after each session. So we've also got a mini survey that shouldn't take more than 2 to 3 minutes at the most after each session. If you could just hop on the website, share your feedback, it really does help us do real-time pivots and real-time adjustments to whether it's the format, whether it's presentations, you name it, really wanting to hear from you all. So Wendy did pull up our website. So if we could just pivot to that really quickly. So if you go actually back to the homepage, which is where people would land initially, there, and you scroll all the way to the bottom of the screen, you will see a link that says Assembly Meeting Schedules here, and see Assembly Details. And you go there, it has all of our programs, and then at the bottom, you'll see for Assembly members only, and there are 3 surveys. There's the learning session feedback survey that we're really asking each of you just to take a moment to fill that in after each session. The recommendation survey, if you have a recommendation that you'd like to share, and then the independent research survey link as well. So these are all hyperlinked. You can just click on them and share your input, both after the learning sessions and really at any time that we have together. So 3 ways, really 4 ways to share input. Okay, and with that, we can go ahead, and I have the privilege of introducing each of our presenters. And before I do so, I do just want to remind folks that if you have a question at any time during any of the presentations, if you can please put that question into chat. We are tracking all those questions. We've got a spreadsheet. And if there's a question that you see in the chat that you also agree is a really important question to ask, then you would do the +1 @ and then the name of the person that asked that question. And that's how we'll be prioritizing the questions that we ask the presenters during the Q&A. And with that, I have the pleasure of introducing our first speaker for the night, Dr. Amy Snover, who will be presenting on climate change and climate impacts in Washington State. Dr. Snover is the director of the University of Washington's Climate Impacts Group, the University Director of the Northwest Climate Adaptation Science Center, and affiliate associate professor in the University of Washington School of Marine and Environmental Affairs. She works with a broad range of decision makers to develop science-based climate risk management strategies, identify research priorities, and build climate resilience. Welcome, Dr. Snover, and thank you so much for being here tonight.
Thank you so much, Gretchen, and thanks everyone who is here tonight for the important work that you're doing, learning about climate change and making some recommendations. So next slide, please. I just want to tell you a little bit about the group that I direct, and so where a lot of this research is coming from. Gretchen mentioned I direct the Climate Impacts Group at the University of Washington. We're celebrating our 25th year this year, and the work we do is develop science understanding of the local impacts of climate change. We basically translate the big global stuff into the local impacts, and we work with folks to use that information in planning and decision making. Next slide. So I have a lot to talk to you about tonight, and some of these slides have more text on them than I would normally do, but what I wanted to do is have the text on there so you could take a look at it later. I'm not going to read all the way through it or tell you every single thing that's on the slides, but I'm happy to make the slides available to you for later for your reference. So just as a little background before we get to looking at the impacts of climate change on Washington State, I would just want to back up and say, what are we really talking about when we're talking about human-caused climate change? And before I talk about human-caused climate change, excuse me, I dropped my headphone. I want to acknowledge, of course, that there are natural causes of climate change that we've seen over the past. They include changes in the sun, changes in the Earth's orbit, volcanic eruptions. These things happen and continue to influence the climate, but are not a major cause of the warming that we've recently experienced, nor are they a major factor in the warming we're expecting. So it's also obvious to everyone here that climate changes can also be human caused. And the way that humans are influencing the climate is by changing the gases in the atmosphere. So we're adding to the natural greenhouse effect. There are some greenhouse gases in the atmosphere naturally, and they cause the Earth to actually be habitable. It would be a frozen planet if we didn't have those to keep us warm. But what we're doing is we're adding to those and increasing the heat trapping ability. So a really super simplified schematic there about greenhouse warmth and why it was called greenhouse gases because like a greenhouse, the Earth's atmosphere lets sunlight through it. And that sunlight comes inside and warms up the Earth, which then radiates heat, radiates warmth. And the greenhouse would trap that heat, and greenhouse gases trap that heat. So by adding greenhouse gases to the atmosphere, we're increasing the heat trapping capacity, or if you want a different analogy, we're thickening the blanket that's on the Earth. Next slide, please. So the more greenhouse gases you have in the atmosphere, the more heat is trapped and the more warming is caused. And so over the past 100 or so years since the Industrial Revolution, we have seen greenhouse gases dramatically increase in the atmosphere as a result of human activities. And this figure at the bottom shows you CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere from 800,000 years ago on the left, moving forward in time to the present day on the right. And you can see how greenhouse gases, CO2 in the atmosphere, oscillated up and down because of natural causes, and now have skyrocketed through the roof as a result of human activities, primarily the burning of fossil fuels. So we've, as a result of these increases in greenhouse gases like CO2, global temperature has increased by about 1 degree Celsius or 1.8 degrees Fahrenheit since pre-industrial times. And the vast majority of this is caused by human activities or greenhouse gases. Next slide. So as we look forward, we've already emitted lots of greenhouse gases, and we still are emitting more greenhouse gases every day. And so the question quite a while ago stopped being about whether climate will change as a result of human activities, but how fast and how much it will change in the future. And that is actually a question that you have some influence over, every single one of us does, right? So this graph here is showing global temperature from during the 20th century. You see 1900 to 2000, and there's the gray, the black line with a gray shading, showing a slight amount of warming that has occurred so far. It actually goes pre-industrial is back around 1750, so that 1 degree of warming happened over a long period of time. But then when this graph was made, you saw there's a break there between what was observed, what we'd already experienced, and what might happen in the future. And so what might happen in the future is shown on this graph in these 4, or I think there's 5, I can't count, 4 colored lines, right? That show various amounts of warming over the 2100s, from a pretty small amount to really large amounts, another 4 degrees Celsius, which is almost 10 degrees Fahrenheit. So the question as we look forward is, how much will the climate warm? And the answer is, we don't know. The answer is, it depends. And what it depends on is how quickly greenhouse gas emissions are reduced, or put it another way, how many greenhouse gases we still put in the atmosphere. The more there are, the warmer it is. And so, however, one other point I want to make on this slide is that you see that under every single one of these scenarios of possible futures, they all show warming compared to where we are now. And that's because we've already emitted greenhouse gases and already committed ourselves to some degree of warming. And so in my talk, the rest of my talk, I'm really going to show you what that means for Washington State, what kind of changes we have in store for us, and what range we might experience depending on different amounts of warming. Next slide, please. Okay, so there we go. I introduced myself. What do we anticipate in Washington State? Next slide. So this is a figure showing the rapid warming that we expect in Washington State, and the numbers that are from the graph are shown on the right if you'd rather look at it written down rather than in the picture form. So what I'm showing is that there's been some small, modest warming in the Northwest. Again, this is for the Northwest over the 1900s. And then as we go into this century, this figure shows 2 possible futures for warming that we experience instead of the 4 I showed on the other page, but they're related to those. It's 2 out of those 4. And you can see that if we go on a high greenhouse gas emissions pathway, if we continue to emit greenhouse gases at very high rates, as we have been, we'll see a warming of around 6 degrees by the 2050s in the state of Washington. If we're on a lower emissions trajectory, we'll see a warming of around 4 degrees in the state of Washington in the 2050s. And the further you go on into the future, the greater these differences become. Next slide. So that's the rapid warming that we expect under all scenarios for Washington state. And there's other aspects of climate change that'll come along with that. We expect to see heavier rains. So when it rains hard, it'll rain harder. Because of the warming, we expect less snow, earlier melt of that snow, and change in timing of natural water availability in our streams, with higher high flows, meaning more floods, lower low flows, and increased in droughts. We expect sea level to continue to rise. And on top of it all, we will still continue to see natural climate variability, years that are warmer or cooler than we expect, wetter or drier. That will continue to happen as well. So the next slide shows a summary from the National Climate Assessment. And I know the team is going to provide you with some links to the National Climate Assessment reports on the Northwest. But there are 3 main ways that those climate changes will unfold or link to consequences on the ground here in the Northwest. One is through these changes in water, in snowpack and water availability, transforming the nature of our mountain ecosystems and the stream ecosystems that depend on them. We also expect to see dramatic transformation of our forest landscapes through the combined impacts of increased fire, increased drought stress, increased insects. And then on the coastal areas, we expect to see major impacts from the combined effects of sea level rise, erosion, flooding, and river flooding as well. So these are the 3 main impact pathways that the National Climate Assessment laid out. If you like to think from the logic of, oh, the climate changes globally, then the climate changes regionally, and then those changes in temperature and precip, what do they mean for the actual ecosystems and hydrology and other things of our region? Next slide. Yep, there's a couple specific examples of this showing increased likelihood of large floods, large river flows, especially in Puget Sound rivers. Next slide, please. We expect to see the area burned by wildfire in our forested ecosystems to roughly quadruple by the 2040s. Next slide, please. And we will expect sea level rise to continue to accelerate with different amounts of sea level rise expected for different locations around the state. And I want to pause here. Oh, I'll say this one and then I'll pause. And so as an example, why does sea level rise matter? Is because one of the effects is to flood low-lying areas. And so these are maps from the city of Olympia and the city of Seattle, where they've already done their own analyses showing which parts of the downtown areas are vulnerable to flooding. Of course, this is not just an effect, an important thing for urban areas, right? It affects all of our coasts and habitat. But this is just one example of the kinds of analyses that have been done by entities within this region who are concerned about these impacts and thinking about how to prepare for them. So I want to pause just for a second and just give you a little roadmap to the rest of what I'm going to talk about, because I recognize that this is just a huge amount of information kind of quickly. And one of the reasons I'm doing it this way is because you have numerous other people speaking to you about different aspects of climate impacts locally. And so I know that, just this very evening, you'll be hearing from Dr. Ebi about talking about health impacts of climate change. I know that Preston Hardison and then Eliza Giddis are going to be talking about tribal considerations and consequences of climate change. You're hearing from people talking about wildlife and habitat impacts, forests and fire impacts, economic costs, and other health impacts as well from the Department of Health. So I am giving a kind of blistering overview of a lot of these different features to just give you a sense of that there are so many different ways that climate change will affect life here. And there's so many different places we need to be thinking about it. And there's so many reasons that it matters. And then hopefully these other folks will be able to give you a chance to sort of dig a little bit deeper into the specific topics. Okay, so next slide, please. This next series of slides shares some findings from another national climate assessment, the 4th National Climate Assessment, that describes 4 major, I think it's 4 major ways, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 major ways that major aspects of life in the Northwest that are at risk because of climate change. So they highlight the risks that climate change is bringing to our natural resource economies, in particular agriculture through changes of pests and disease, changes in water availability, impacts on forestry and fisheries, and outdoor recreation, for example. So any one of these, I could give you a deep dive and tell you all the ways and why climate change matters, but just like, let's wrap it up for now and say Northwest natural resource economies are at risk from climate change. Next slide. The National Climate Assessment also pointed out that a core aspect of our risks here is how climate change will threaten critical Northwest infrastructure. So there are many, many different sort of hazards that climate change will pose to our infrastructure, from sea level rise and storm surge to more frequent heat waves and fires, landslides, erosions. All of those risk factors that climate change will worsen are listed at the bottom of the slide. And then here in the middle are some lists of the critical infrastructure that it will be threatened by this. Our shoreline infrastructure, electricity systems, really, supply, demand changes and transmission, other roads and bridges, all kinds of infrastructure are threatened by climate change and need to be sort of updated to be able to cope in the current and future climate. Next slide. National Climate Assessment also mentioned the threats climate change brings to our already endangered natural environment and cultural heritage. And they point out the negative implications for fish, wildlife, plants, cultural activities, especially for Native American tribes, for recreation, outdoor access. There are all kinds of aspects of this that are threatened by climate change. Next slide. So Dr. Ebi will be talking about some of the challenges that climate change brings in the health context. National Climate Assessment also talked about, actually this came out before the pandemic, talking about the stresses that climate change will bring to our already stressed health system. That was before it was even more stressed. Exacerbating heat and waterborne diseases, vector-borne diseases, wildfire, smoke, hazards, lots of things that I think you'll hear more about later. Next slide. And then finally, the National Climate Assessment really emphasized that climate impacts don't affect all equally. Some people are more exposed, more vulnerable, or less able to cope with these impacts. And in many cases, the impacts of climate change will just worsen existing inequities. So the climate assessment highlighted vulnerable frontline communities in the Northwest, communities we expect vulnerable to the impacts we expect here. And those include Native American tribes, farm workers, rural and urban low-income populations, and also rural natural resource dependent communities. So I want to wrap up by just reminding you that there's 2 important components that contribute to how much harm climate change will cause for us. So first, let's back up and say what causes the harm. So the extent of harm from global warming will depend on how much warming occurs, right? Next, click again, please. And of course, how much warming occurs depends on how much greenhouse gases are emitted, and really, crucially, on how fast we reduce and ultimately eliminate our emissions. So our actions today shape our risks tomorrow. And that's through choices about energy use and fuel type and greenhouse gas emissions that are allowed. extent of harm also depends on our resilience to warming's impacts. So some amount of all of those impacts that I just described will happen because we have set that change in motion. They'll be bigger and faster or later and less, depending on our choices about emissions, but we will expect something. And so our resilience to warming's impacts is shaped by today's actions again, which are about choices about how we build our bridges, prepare our farms, grow our communities, or other ways adapt our systems to prepare for these risks. And so that's why I prepared a recommendation for you all to consider that's fairly general but super important, which is to include considerations of climate impacts in our planning and decision making, so we make sure that all of our public investments and all of our communities' hopes and dreams are resilient to climate change. So I just want to close by reminding you this, that every single day people are making decisions and investments that will either worsen or lessen the impacts of climate change. And that's because of both its impacts on emissions and its impacts on our preparedness for decades to come. So you are just doing really, really super important work as you work to influence those decisions. And that is the end, except for my contact information, which is the next slide. So thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Dr. Snover, for being with us tonight and sharing your presentation as well. And with that, I am going to pause for about 30 seconds between presenters before I introduce our next speaker. Okay, excellent. So our next speaker is Dr. Christy Eby, and she's presenting on the intersection of climate change and health. Dr. Eby is a professor in the Center for Health and the Global Environment at the University of Washington. She's been conducting research and practice in the health risks of climate variability and change for nearly 25 years, focusing on understanding sources of vulnerability, estimating current impacts and future health risks, designing adaptation policies and measures to reduce the risks of climate change in multi-stressor environments, and estimating the health co-benefits of mitigation policies. Welcome, Dr. Eby, and thank you so much for being here tonight.
Thank you so much for inviting me, and thank you everyone for your interest in the topic on how climate change is affecting the health of all Washingtonians. And thank you, Dr. Snover, for an excellent presentation. It's a great introduction. And I wanted to start with something a little more fun, perhaps. If you haven't seen these are called the warming stripes, developed by Ed Hawkins in the United Kingdom. And basically, using a baseline of 1971 to 2000, looked at temperatures from just after the start of the Industrial Revolution, when humans started emitting greenhouse gases, mostly by burning fossil fuels, but also by deforestation, and then looking at the temperature change over time. And the trend is really quite obvious. It's quite a visual, striking image. And this is globally. One of the key issues that I wanted to underscore from what Dr. Snover said is there's a lot of complexities underneath this, that globally there are changes going on in our environment caused by humans, but those changes are not the same everywhere. And these are the stripes for the state of Washington. So you can see that there's not as even a pattern. We still see overall warming. It's not as strong as it's been globally. And there's been quite a lot of variability over the years. And we need to take this into account as we invest in taking action to protect our health and our well-being. I also wanted to emphasize something that Dr. Snover talked about, which is the rate of change. These are some stills I took out of a NASA video clip. Obviously, this is the globe. On the right-hand side, you can see 1880 to 1884, just after the start of the Industrial Revolution. And these are temperatures compared to 1961 to 90. So as you'd expect, before humans really started pumping out greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, that by and large, most of the Earth was a lot cooler than it was in 1961 to 90. This is 100 years after that. As you can see in the scale on the left-hand side, that blue temperatures are cooler and then warmer temperatures are yellow into red. So this is 100 years after the last slide. This is 10 years after the slide before, and this is 10 years after the slide before that. This really illustrates the challenge we're facing with the rate of change. The rate of change shifted somewhere in the 1970s, 1980s. And so we're seeing very rapid warming in most places around the Earth. And you saw a variation of this from Dr. Snover. These are projections where the 0 is pre-industrial, shows you the observations and shows the projections into the near term. As she said, the Earth has warmed 1 degree Celsius, and we're on track within the next 20 to 30 years to warm another ½ degree. And you can see also on this figure, the change in the slope. You can see starting in here in the 1970s, the big increase in change. And that's very important for health, as I'll talk about over the course of the next few minutes. I'm going to run through and talk about, somebody wants control of my screen. Can I continue to do my own slides? Somebody's asked to control my screen.
You can just reject that. You should be able to move your own slides forward.
Okay,
so
thank you.
Just cancel it.
Okay, thanks. I didn't want somebody to take over and there. Okay, let me decline that. I'm gonna go through some of the issues that are important for health. One is heat. These were the number of records that were broken in the summer of 2020. You can see that we were very fortunate here in the state of Washington to not have broken temperature records. We were lucky in 2020, we're not lucky every year. And you can see how many records were broken. Slides are being grumpy. When we think about heat, on the left-hand side is a figure that shows you this very nice smooth curve of temperature distribution over the course of a year. And you can see in an average year, wherever this is located, it's just a made up figure. You've got extreme cold and you've got extreme heat. As the climate continues to change, sorry about that, as the climate continues to change, the average shifts to the right, which gives you more extreme heat. But in fact, what is happening is that curve is flattening and moving further out to the right. So we're seeing a very large increase in extreme heat. The figures on the left were work that was done for a report for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. These look at June, July, and August, JJA. The left column is moderate greenhouse gas emissions. The right column is high greenhouse gas emissions. You can see the rows are labeled by years. What the authors did was take 26 world regions, and they looked at, over the period 1985 to 2005, what was the one hottest day in the year? How often did that occur? And the question in each one of these model runs was, under these different assumptions of greenhouse gas emissions, how often would that one hot temperature occur? Right now, we're still under high emissions, so the top right figure, and you can see there's parts of the tropic where that one hot day is now occurring on average every year. In the middle of the century, in the left-hand figure, let's hope we're down to moderate emissions or less. You can see many parts of the world will see that one hot day more frequently than occurred in 1985 to 2005. One conclusion, as I always tell my students, is when they get to be as old as I am, they're going to look back and think about how nice the summers used to be. Summers are going to get hotter and they're going to get more humid. And that matters for our health. When we think about all of the various drivers of climate-sensitive health outcomes, this is from the 4th National Climate Assessment. As you look down the middle, it shows you the various changes that are occurring with climate change and temperature and precipitation. Those affect various exposure pathways. I just spoke briefly about heat. And then those affect health outcomes. But it's not just climate. It's a range of other factors as well. So on the left and the right, you see environmental, institutional, social, and behavioral factors. So the age distribution of the population determines in part how many people will suffer from the heat. So we have to take into account a whole range of factors. And even given that complexity, the fourth National Climate Assessment concluded that climate change is affecting the health of all Americans. And it's already happening now, and something that we need to take into account when we think about where our investments need to go to protect human health and well-being into the future. We know that exposure and resilience vary across populations and communities. We've got lots of information, for example, with heat. And this lists some of those populations and communities that are much higher risk. And there's comments in here, it's also from the fourth National Climate Assessment, of what can be done to try and reduce that. So on the one hand, we have lots of uncertainty about what's going to happen with the changing climate. On the other hand, there's a lot we already know, and there's a lot we can base decisions on. And there is no reason to delay action to protect our health from a changing climate. One of the things that NOAA, the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration, follows are billion-dollar disasters. These are the billion-dollar disasters for 2020. These are not the $100 million disasters. They're not the $1 million disasters. They're not the $10,000 disasters. These are the very big disasters. And of course, for us on the West Coast, 2020 was characterized by wildfire. But you can see the other kinds of disasters around the US. Overall, there was $16 billion disasters. And I believe the total cost was over $50 billion just to deal with these very large disasters, not even considering the smaller ones. On the left is a figure that shows you that when the temperature goes up, there's more wildfire risk. And I want to focus on the right. So this shows you the risk for our health from wildfire smoke, and shows you the air quality index across the bottom, shows you the increase in diabetes, lung disease, and heart disease. I also want to point out that air quality index goes to 120. Where I live in Seattle, our air quality index during the height of the wildfires was about 250. There were parts of our state, there were parts of Oregon where the air quality index was well over 300. So incredibly hazardous for everybody. Dr. Snover mentioned flooding. We do have flooding in our state. And an issue I wanted to bring up in particular is the work on the right from Public Health England. There's been several very large floods over the last several years in England. And they went out purposely after those floods to look at mental health issues. You can see they divided the population into people whose houses were flooded, people whose lives were disrupted but not flooded, and then people who are unaffected. And you can see the very large increase in probable depression, anxiety, and post-traumatic stress disorder for those who were flooded. Those people are being followed up. The third-year follow-up has recently published, showing there's still more mental health issues in people who are flooded. We don't have good data to follow how much people are being affected by these extreme weather and climate events. We all have stories in our own lives, but we do need data to get a better sense of how severe the mental health consequences are and what we need to do to prevent them when future events arise. I mentioned heat a couple of minutes ago. There's lots that can be done about heat. There are action plans. I've got a picture of a poster that's put up in Quebec. At the top, you can see something from Phoenix. There's a lot that can be done to prevent people dying in the heat. Nobody needs to die in a heat wave. It's completely preventable. Not completely, but almost completely preventable. And so there's ways to implement heat action plans to really reduce the risk. I also put in a headline from Bloomberg News in January of 2020 that we have better understanding from recent research looking at redlining in the 1930s to prevent our Black and brown citizens from having access to mortgages. And that has confined them to neighborhoods where there's fewer trees, where they get hotter. And so there's greater impacts in those communities because of historic discrimination. And again, actions can be taken to reduce that and make sure that going forward, that there isn't this legacy of redlining on their mortality during heat waves. And it's not just that. This is some relatively recent research looking at life support calls when people call emergency services, and looking at the distribution. The darker the color, the greater the risk during a heat wave compared with a non-heat day. And you can see the risks are higher for locations where there's more impervious surfaces, where the population has more people over the age of 65, and when there's a higher percentage of poverty. This underscores the previous comments I made about how we need to think about how climate change as a stress multiplier interacts with other forces in our society, and how we can work collectively as we address poverty to make sure that we also address climate change, and vice versa. As we address climate change, we take into account the challenges of dealing with populations that have been historically marginalized. Another challenge we're going to face in our state is worker productivity. We have, of course, quite a lot of agricultural workers in the eastern part of the state. And there's been a lot of work that has been looking at what's going to happen as temperatures continue to rise. These maps of the US at the top show present day. The middle show a world that's warmed by 2 degrees C, which means we're already at 1, so a doubling of temperatures, which under current emissions we will reach before the end of the century. And the bottom shows a world that's 4 degrees, which is if we don't keep our greenhouse gas emissions under control, we might reach by the end of the century. Again, the darker the color shows the number of heat wave days, larger number of heat wave days where people are affected. You can see today in Eastern Washington, really not much of an impact of higher temperatures. But as we go to the middle towards the end of the century, that number just continues to increase, depending on our greenhouse gas emissions. And again, there's actions that can be taken to ensure that workers are protected as the heat continues to rise. If we were in person, I would ask how many of you have allergies or asthma. It's usually quite a few people in the audience. The map on the left shows you for ragweed, and I assume a few people are allergic to ragweed. It's one of the more popular allergens. You can see how over the last couple of decades, the seasonal length of ragweed has increased. We're not quite at a month extra, but we're getting close to a month longer ragweed season. And with higher carbon dioxide, there is more pollen. So you can see on the top right, the figure of how pollen concentrations are projected to change as carbon dioxide increases. We fortunately don't have poison ivy, but there are a number of toxic plants that are growing bigger with higher carbon dioxide. And so we're expecting to have other consequences for allergies and asthma. I will not go through this. I understand this is a complicated slide. This is looking at diseases carried by mosquitoes. And this is just a figure that when you look at it in the top right and the top left, you can see precipitation and temperature. And it just makes the point that we know temperature and precipitation affect the development, survival, and reproduction of mosquitoes. Temperature also affects the virus that mosquitoes can pick up and how quickly the virus or other pathogen replicates within the mosquito before it is injected into a human being. We know weather is fundamental to the pattern of infectious diseases around the US. One particular mosquito that we're concerned about is called Aedes aegypti. Aedes aegypti is a mosquito that can carry dengue fever, chikungunya, Zika virus, and yellow fever. It's a problem that we are concerned about in public health, causes significant burden of disease in many countries. The map at the top left shows you the present suitability for that mosquito to live in a particular environment. The present suitability is kind of a beige buff color. And the future suitability towards the end of the century under high greenhouse gas emissions is in the kind of funny red color. And you can see here that Seattle very much could have a climate suitable for this mosquito. But just because we have the mosquito doesn't mean we'll have the disease. Because as I implied in the last slide, there's a complicated interaction between mosquito survival and when you have temperatures that are hot enough for long enough that if a mosquito does ingest a particular virus like dengue fever, that the virus replicates in the mosquito and then can be injected into somebody else. And when you take that into account, you can see on the right-hand figure for suitability for transmission, we're in the clear, which is, right, it's great news. We're in the clear. We don't have to worry about this. But we already know there's more mosquito days per year. We've got data from San Francisco showing the increase in the number of mosquito days. And on the right is a headline from 2017 that this mosquito was found in Toronto, Toledo, and Detroit. There's now breeding colonies of this mosquito that far north. So we're not safe for the end of the century in being protected from having diseases like dengue fever. The question now is when, not if. This is a summary that we put together at the Center for Health and the Global Environment to look at what climate change could mean for the health of Washingtonians. You can see in the middle.
1 minute left.
Yeah, I think this is my last slide.
Great.
And so you can see in the middle some of the factors we've talked about: temperature, weather, extreme weather. Around that are some of the factors I mentioned before that interact with weather patterns. Around that, you can see the transmission pathways we're concerned about: water and food supply, water quality, extreme heat. And on the outside of that, you can see a partial, this is not a full list, of all the ways that climate change could affect the health of Washingtonians. It's already started. And as Dr. Snover said, if we don't decrease our greenhouse gas emissions, we're looking at a future where we're going to see very different kinds of disease patterns. And we do need to get going. We need to invest in adaptation so that we're prepared for change, and we need to invest in mitigation so we reduce the damages later in the century. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much for your presentation, and thank you so much for being here tonight. And with that, I will go ahead and just pause for about 30 seconds. If folks need to do your favorite stretch, stand up for just a minute, whatever it takes. I know it's late and you all have had full days before even coming here tonight. So just pausing for just briefly before we go to our next presentation.
Can I answer one of the questions?
Not yet.
Okay.
Thank you. I
When it's
appreciate your enthusiasm. Yeah. Okay. So as folks get settled back in, our next presenter is Dr. Deb Morrison, and she'll be presenting on climate education and climate justice education. Dr. Morrison is deeply engaged in research practice partnership efforts around equity and justice in STEM learning contexts, particularly with respect to furthering climate justice. She's particularly interested in content intersecting with environmental literacy, justice, and sustainability. And we've got you down for 15 minutes, Dr. Morrison, and thanks so much for joining us.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. All right. So I have a tiny URL, which I think Wendy's going to throw in the chat for you. It has a number of different resources and backgrounds. So I'm going to give you the highlights version of everything, and then really have time for yourself to dig into resources when you have the space to do that. So in thinking about learning, I want to actually start with some resources. Thanks so much for the organizers for having an Indigenous land acknowledgement. There's some resources here that are helpful to understand why that's important, and to understand the idea of Indigenous invisibility and how that it becomes visibility. So just some resources there for folks to dig into. Equally, I think it's important for you to understand your own places in the world across the state, how there are many different nations that make up Washington state. And so this resource really helps you understand that and learn more from the tribal nations. It links to each of the tribal nation sites. So I would encourage folks to do that as well. You'll understand how this all rolls into climate justice in the end. Additionally, there's understandings of racial oppression that have to go hand in hand with climate learning. And so there's a number of different resources at the Black Lives Matter movement, which are just phenomenal for helping people think about who it is that they are and positionally and what their work is in the world with respect to racial justice. Today, I'm going to talk to you about two different things. One is about some basic concepts. Our speakers so far have talked about many of these. I'm going to give you the super 8th grade version of it and how that relates to climate justice, and then some resources around climate justice in relation to the intersections of learning, education, and justice. So basic concepts first. There are a lot of different kinds of carbon. This comes from a Nature paper that is cited and linked to the slides. Of all these different forms of carbon, we need to think about like what do each of them do? How do they relate to the carbon cycle? And in particular, with relation to atmospheric carbon, how are they pulling carbon out of the atmosphere, or how are they releasing it into the atmosphere? So that's sequestration or emissions. I loved Dr. Snover's understanding of the greenhouse effect. I'm going to give you this very graphical, like 10,000 foot level of it. Energy comes in. I'm going to speak in terms of energy instead of just heat because I want to come back to why we teach about energy. So energy comes in from the sun. It gets reflected off clouds, off the top of the atmosphere. Some of it gets absorbed and re-emitted by the Earth. Some of those re-emissions are reflected back out to space. Others come back to Earth. So it's a big bounce, bounce, bounce. That's what happens in that normally is we have a radiative equilibrium, so a balance. But what happens if we add more greenhouse gases? That's the question. So anthropogenic greenhouse sort of heating or warming is really about humans adding more greenhouse gases. So here we get an increased trapping of energy close to the surface. And this is what we talk about when we talk about the greenhouse effect, like what was discussed earlier. So we need to understand that. We need to think about how we can sequester more, pull more carbon out of the atmosphere, and how we can release less, so less emissions. That's our goal when we're thinking about learning, and we're thinking about learning to accelerate a just climate action in the world, is we're trying to understand how to sequester more and release less. And not to be outstated, it's not just that energy is bouncing back and forth off the atmosphere. There are also feedback loops in very much more complex ways than what I've had said here. I'm sure Dr. Snover's cringing at my short version. But this is, there are many feedbacks in terms of biological feedbacks, physical feedbacks that are going on in the system. And we are feeling some of those impacts already and will for hundreds of years, actually, before we can totally get back to a more sort of pre-industrial balance space. There are lots of places to learn about climate change. I highly encourage these particular resources because they are in very much everyday language. And really are good starting points as you dig into your own journey on understanding climate change. Some of them are governmental, some of them are funded through NSF, some of them are more community projects. So really, this Climate Toolkit is one of the newest ones. It's a free OER resource, open educational resource that was just produced by Dr. Frank Granshaw down in Oregon. Really fabulous resource. Another piece of understanding that I think is helpful is understanding the words mitigation and adaptation get thrown around a lot. So they're used in multiple ways. So you actually have to clarify every time you use them how they're used because there's actually some confusion. And it has to do with the fact that there's overlap in this use. This red area is the overlap in use. But loosely, we talk about mitigation as actions that reduce emissions, and adaptation is coping with the impacts, like coping with the actual reality of what we're getting right now. I really do also want to put on the table a definition for climate justice. So climate justice insists on a shift from a discourse of just greenhouse gases and melting ice caps into a civil rights movement that people and communities most valuable to climate impacts are at its heart. That's from Mary Robinson, who has done incredible international work. And this is where you start to see an intersection with things like the Climate Justice Alliance work, Indigenous environmental rights, the Rural Climate Network, NAACP's Environment and Climate Justice Program, and more locally in Washington State, folks like the Silica Bio and their work. All of these groups, though, have connections into Washington State, and as you're sort of learning and thinking, there are links to all of these available. So when we're thinking about learning to accelerate just climate action, we're actually looking at a complex system. We're trying to think about justice, communities, action, because we don't want to just learn for learning's sake. And we want to think about how that's connected to place, this specific set of locations and circumstances, cross-cultural and intergenerational. And we really, really have to start thinking about designing learning that crosses all different boundaries. So interdisciplinary, intersectoral, all of those things. The Action for Climate Empowerment program at the United Nations is part of the UNFCCC, which is the Climate Change Convention, and the Paris Agreement, which is sort of a re-up on the Climate Convention. And it names 6 areas that really involve climate learning. Education is one of them. So often we reduce climate learning to education only, but climate learning includes training, public awareness, public access to information, public participation, like this event, and international cooperation. It also touches on another piece of UN policy, which is the Sustainable Development Goals. And this is a great resource for thinking about all the different ways that learning connects out to the, it's a brand new report that was put out for thinking about how education connects to all of the different sectors. When we think about designing learning, we also want to think about how we structurally and systemically organize learning. So things like our STEM teaching tools at the Institute of Science and Math Education, how are we providing supports for educators to engage in complicated areas of climate change education? The Climate Change Education Collective is looking at things like how are we synthesizing research on climate learning? CLEAN is thinking about how are we bridging the research practice divide for scientists doing outreach around learning. And then there's things like the Tribal Climate Camp, how are tribal nations learning from each other and sharing their work and learning with youth. And the ACE National Strategy, which is starting to move inside the Biden administration and move more systemically, is about how do we coordinate this across the whole nation or within a state. Climb Time, the Washington State Climb Time Initiative, has been doing some of this work. And internally, it's actually the only state initiative so far. There's a few others being proposed in other states like New York, California, New Jersey, and a few others. But we are in our 3rd year of activity now, and it has a terrific amount of resources for Washington State educators. And just to learn, I really encourage people to look at that. These are some examples of briefs that are created by STEM teaching tools. They cover a wide range of things, from things like place-based learning to culturally responsive instruction, controversial topics, things that are all covered and sort of intersect with different aspects of climate and climate justice learning. You also need to think about this aspect of where education and training overlap. So what kind of career training can we engage in? Green careers, energy careers, climate careers. Pretty much any career going forward has some aspect of climate learning related to it. So how are we actually really thinking about this? So Climate Generation out in Minneapolis has produced some resources around that. And this area is really starting to expand significantly. The Climb Time Initiative has a number of portraits of practice that help you really see what climate learning might look like if we engage community, if we engage tribal nations, if we design from the ground up in these different settings. And all of the resources are OER, open educational resources. So please do go ahead and dig around in there and see what's interesting to you. The idea is to cross these boundaries, have students and educators, communities, businesses, universities, and educational organizations really working together to design and learn. I also just have to give a shout out for the youth. I mean, wow, have they been really pushing many of the adults to do better. So folks like Isra Hirsi and Autumn Peltier. Autumn here down in the bottom corner is from my own home country of Canada. And they're really asking these questions like whose future is being centered in this learning and what futures are possible if we author them. So we really need to think about this in designing learning and designing action in this space. There's a number of youth summits and other youth environmental activities going on, things like the Wild Center's work or Climate Generation, and they are reaching out and collaborating with us. We've had collaborations with both of them in Washington State. And of course, Dr. Megan Bang's work on learning in places, really centering Indigenous communities and voices and thinking about, I'm down to 12 minutes, I have 3 minutes left. So really thinking about how it is that we are working across different cultural boundaries and understanding different perspectives and ways of thinking and being in the world. Rethinking Schools out of Portland and Oregon also has launched a Teach Climate Justice campaign, and I really want to give them a shout out and some of the folks in Portland Public Schools who have just been leading the nation in the ways that we can structure and organize and push forward this type of lens on learning. Oops. And last, did I stop share? No. Last slide, I wanted to just name 2 more things. One was around thinking about transformative action. We need to educate ourselves and think from different perspectives and lenses. So these are my favorite go-to resources for our own personal learning journeys that I think we should engage with. And they're hopeful. I know that climate change can be a very, very heavy topic. I've been working on it for 30 years and all I feel is hope about the way things are going right now. And it's from reading things like this. So I do encourage folks to dig into these resources. In terms of recommendations, I have 3 primary things that I think should be done. 1, we need to support systemic funding for transformative climate learning everywhere. Everything we can do should have a learning component with it. We need to foster life-wide, life-deep, and lifelong climate justice learning, not only for youth, but for all ages of people in every context. And we also need to build systems of support for educators. Educators themselves are learners. And so we need to think about how to help them teach climate science, climate justice, and specifically engage in justice-centered pedagogy. So learning to learn how to shift the way that we structure learning. All right, so I'm going to stop there and really do encourage folks to dig into the resources that I had, and I believe they did get posted, but I will also drop the tiny URL into the link. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Morrison. Really appreciate it. And just as a point of process too, you'll notice that each of the presenters have a set of recommendations that they're presenting to you all for consideration. And we've asked each of the presenters throughout the learning sessions to share any recommendations that they may have for your all's consideration. We're tracking all of it. And as I mentioned at the beginning of the meeting tonight as well, you all are very encouraged as assembly members to come up with your own recommendations. But we are capturing all of them in a master list and we'll be sharing them with you all for consideration and discussion during the deliberative sessions. And with that, I am going to take the 30-second requisite, just take the time you need. You just heard a lot of information. We've got a couple of presenters left. If you need to stand up, stretch. Excellent. So Dr. Claire Richards is joining us as well, and she's presenting on the health impacts of power outages and extreme weather. Dr. Richards is an assistant professor at the Washington State University College of Nursing, and Claire's research focuses on the quality of care for patients, and she has expanded this focus of her work to include environmental drivers of health outcomes, such as power outages. And we've got you down for 15 minutes. Thank you so much, Dr. Richards, for being here. We can't hear you yet. I think you're still muted, Dr. Richards.
There we go. Sorry, slide problems. Thank you for having me. I am here to share a little bit about what I know about health impacts and power outages and extreme weather. I am presenting as a citizen lobbyist, and my statements and recommendations do not reflect those of my employer. This is my very cute son, so it is not a gratuitous picture of him. But really, I am here as a nurse and a mother who wants a better future for the next generation than the one we are currently set up to create. So I'm here to share with you a piece of the climate change puzzle, recognizing that climate change is a complex issue across many different sectors in problems and how our society is organized. So I want to thank all of you here today for listening to the many different perspectives to propose solutions to this very important public health crisis. So today I'll share a little bit, a very brief case study just to get a sense of the big picture of the relationship between extreme weather and power outages and health. And then a bit of a big picture view of the relationships. And then I will share a little bit about the health impacts of extreme weather and power outages, a bit on prevention strategies, and I'll touch on structural and social determinants of health as they relate to this problem. So for my case study, I have a 65-year-old woman living at home with lung and heart disease. She relies on an oxygen concentrator. She uses an air purifier and a fan. Her home is drafty and poorly insulated. Her neighborhood lacks tree canopy. So she has the heat island effect where her home is hotter than, say, if she was to live in a different neighborhood. She has limited income and she cannot afford a backup generator. So if the power goes out, her oxygen concentrator won't work, which means that she'll need to use like an oxygen tank. And those are kind of heavy to lug around, especially living alone. Any kind of other weather circumstances that can go along with the power outage, like hot weather, cold weather, and wildfire smoke could make the symptoms of her heart and lung disease worse, especially since like she can't control the temperature in her home or use her air purifier. She will experience increased exposure to environmental conditions due to the conditions of her home and her community. So that puts her at risk of hospitalization or death. And so I'll go now to the big picture, the relationships between extreme weather and power outages. So this is a very simple figure showing the relationship between climate change, extreme weather, and power outages. And it's not at all complete. I could draw some more lines here, but I can't cover everything tonight. So I'll start here with the lower right-hand side. You can see combustion of fossil fuels. That leads to greenhouse gas emissions, and that leads to climate change. And then, which then creates the circumstances that are ripe for wildfire, including high temperatures, drought, strong winds, and a longer wildfire season. And so we have an increase in wildfires. And this increase in wildfire leads to air pollution in the form of fine particulate matter and a variety of other toxins that are extremely harmful to human health. And this leads to increased morbidity, which means new and worsening health problems and hospitalizations. and mortality, which means increased death. And high temperatures are often present at the same time as wildfires. And this also has a direct effect on health, as was mentioned earlier, and can worsen the effect of air pollution on health. So when you have the kinds of conditions that lead to wildfires, like those that involve strong winds, you also can knock over a power line. And those, with those conditions ripe with wildfire, you can then get wildfires. Or wildfires can also lead to infrastructure damage. And either way, you get a power outage. And that in itself contributes to morbidity and mortality. So power outages, as I mentioned, can cause death, and I'll talk a little bit more about that, but they can also potentially make the impacts of air pollution and heat worse, like when people can't control the temperature in their home or use air purifiers, or in some cases can't access water and so forth. And I'll talk a little bit more about how that happens. Then we have this relatively new phenomena called, I don't know if I'm going to be able to get the word out, public safety power shutoff energizations, where basically the power utility companies will turn off the electricity to specific areas that are at high risk of wildfire to limit damage to life and property. Now, this has been going on for a long time in rural areas, but in the last decade in California, it's been done more often in areas that are now more heavily populated. And so millions of people are experiencing these outages. And although utility companies in Washington state are not yet required to have a plan for public safety power shutoffs, some utility companies do have these plans or expect to reevaluate this as risks change. So these public safety power shutoffs basically prevent the wildfire, like when a power line falls down, you don't get a wildfire, but it does lead to a power outage, which also results in morbidity and mortality. And so there's a trade-off there in terms of how many people die and how much property is damaged. But in the context of high temperatures, then when you have power outages, those high people, you can still potentially have increased morbidity and mortality from the lack of ability to control temperature in the home. There are other ways in which you get power outages, and I won't talk about them all. And so the health impacts of extreme weather and power outages, as was mentioned earlier, we have an increase in wildfires. We have more wildfires in the West, and we have more acreage that's burned. And so it's important to note that climate change is about increasing the chances of extreme events. It's like weighting your dice. So like you have you can still have years where you don't have wildfires. And then other years where you do, it's just that we increase the frequency of those extreme events. This is a projection of very large fire weeks. So weeks in which conditions are favorable to the occurrence of very large fires, greater than 50,000 acres across the Western US. So I forgot to mention that, we have 10,000 acres here last year. That was a lot. So that's a lot of fire. The darkest red indicates up to a 6-fold increase in that risk compared to 1971 to 2000, our recent history. So this means a lot more of these kinds of miserable days that we experienced recently. And the health impacts of wildfire smoke, we're still kind of learning about them, unfortunately, because it's kind of a new thing. But we have the direct impacts of wildfire smoke, like death, asthma and lung disease exacerbations, brain and heart attacks, heart injury, as well as plausibly low birth weight and preterm birth, although that's still being studied. We have also health impacts of extreme heat as well, heat illness, as was mentioned earlier, accelerated death from respiratory disease, cardiovascular disease, hospitalizations. We have the impact on our health services and the potential disruption of infrastructure as power, as I mentioned earlier. We also have, so this is a figure that shows an increase in power outages over time. The yellow line is the weather-related power outages. So we've had an increase in the weather-related power outages over time, whereas the non-weather-related power outages have not increased. And these are actually just the major power outages. This is not all power outages. It's just a specific threshold of 50,000, 500,000 people for at least an hour. So power outages can disrupt a lot of things. They can disrupt electricity to hospitals, although they have a specific kind of backup power plan, dialysis centers, long-term care facilities, pharmacies. They can destroy medicines and vaccines. It can disrupt, like in the home, our health monitoring equipment, like for cardiac equipment or life-sustaining treatments in the home setting. It can disrupt oxygen concentrators, CPAP machines. It can prevent people from charging their wheelchairs, using elevators, using any kind of transit that requires electricity. It can disrupt refrigeration, so it can cause spoiled food. It can also prevent water from being pumped from wells, as well as if you live in a multi-story building. So those pumps will, or some apartment buildings require pumps. So as a result, we have a variety of health impacts, including death, and some of the same other impacts that were mentioned earlier with the addition of carbon monoxide, poisoning, gastrointestinal illness, and exposure to other environmental things like temperature. So prevention strategies, there are a variety of different prevention strategies that can be used, including evacuation, which is obviously difficult for everyone to do and it is inconvenient. But what I'd like to point out is that some recommended strategies for wildfire smoke or heat waves don't work if they overlap with each other or with power outages. So for example, things like air conditioning or water during heat waves or air purifiers during a wildfire event may not be available during a power outage, especially for people who don't have backup energy, which it's very expensive to have a backup generator. I put some just numbers I found online. So also, like you can't open your window for cooling at night if there is a wildfire smoke. And most air purifiers don't clean things like gases. That's just an aside, which a lot of people don't know. I didn't know that for the longest time. It's kind of scary. So some of the most important strategies that we can use are like updating our building codes and our landscaping laws to increase energy efficiency and improving the building envelope kind of sealing. But then when you do that, you have to consider like indoor air quality as well.
And Dr. Richards, we have 1 minute left.
Great, I'm almost done. So like I said, I'm only briefly going to touch on this because I knew I didn't have enough time. Structural and social determinants of health have a role here. So for example, having asthma makes people more sensitive to wildfire smoke, but we also know that we have health disparities with asthma in terms of both people having asthma, like how many people have asthma and how many people actually die from asthma. And this is mostly driven by differences in structural and social determinants of health. So like discriminatory housing practices that were mentioned earlier, environmental injustice, discriminatory hiring practices, and then quality of housing and access to and quality of healthcare. So as a result of all of this, I gave some recommendations that directly come from the slides, which is like basically we need a transition to renewable energy as quickly as we can. We also need to reduce the exposure of vulnerable populations by updating the building codes, developing recommendations for improving ventilation and indoor air quality of homes. We should consider alternatives to like air conditioning that require a lot of energy. So we should think about heat pumps. And then also we should address the resilience of populations, increase the resilience of populations by addressing social and structural determinants of health, which I know is not an easy task, but it has to be said. So thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it, Dr. Richards. And thanks so much for joining us tonight. And with that, we are going to pause for about 30 seconds before we have our final speaker for the night. And then we are going to open it up for our question and answer. So just pausing. And I'm seeing a lot of really great questions in the chat. Thank you all so much for being active on the chat. And as I mentioned, we are getting these uploaded and organized, and we'll be ready during our Q&A time to respond to many of them. And so with that, our final presenter for the night, Hester Sarabrin, who's presenting on clean and just transportation. Hester is a policy director at Transportation Choices Coalition, where everybody works hard for policies that support pedestrians, bicyclists, and bike riders. Hester also sits on the Washington State Transportation Commission. Thank you so much for being here tonight.
Hi, thanks for having me. All right, let's see. Can you see my screen okay? Yes.
Yep.
Okay, great, thank you. Hi, I'm Hester, and I'm here to talk about how we can take a more equitable approach to climate issues in transportation by centering equity and other holistic policy goals. So I work at Transportation Choices Coalition. As Gretchen mentioned, we're a policy and advocacy nonprofit dedicated to making transportation accessible to all in Washington State. We're also part of a larger coalition, the Climate Alliance for Jobs and Clean Energy, which represents labor unions, community of color-based organizations, mobility, health, and environmental organizations. And they host our Clean and Just Transportation Table, whose work I'm here to talk about today. And I've been told we're running out of time, so I will try and go as fast as I can. So here is a chart that I'm sure you've seen before. This is from the Department of Ecology showing GHG emissions in 2017. And probably the reason that I'm here is that I believe it's a plurality of GHG emissions come from the transportation sector, and that's cars, trucks, and mostly other kinds of vehicles. And so you know why we want to do clean transportation, right? We're trying to stop burning fossil fuels and make the transportation we have cleaner. But why just? So why just transportation? Why equitable transportation? I want to talk to you about how critical it is to center equity in climate and transportation work. A lot of the presentations so far have touched on this, but I'm gonna tackle it from a transportation side. So first, I'm going to talk about how we need an equity lens when we choose our climate interventions in order to make sure we're not further exacerbating inequities. And then I'll talk about how we actually need to address systemic racism and inequities if we're going to actually make progress on climate change. So I'm actually not sure how much you've been presented to on this topic, but I would argue that when most people talk about climate interventions in transportation, there is an over-reliance on electrification, whether that's incentives for people to buy electric cars, building out charging stations, cleaning fuels, or electrifying government fleets. While that is definitely a critical component of addressing air quality and GHG emissions, I argue that it's the sole focus, especially if we're focusing on individually owned vehicles, we risk social inequities and other unintended environmental consequences. In short, electrification alone doesn't meet most people's needs and could make some things worse, whether that's stormwater pollution from tires. We know that there's a chemical in tires that poisons salmon, whether it's the life cycle environmental costs of batteries and mining, building more roads and parking to accommodate more vehicles, hydropower impacts on tribes, and some of the gentrification and increased housing costs from building more electric vehicle infrastructure. And I want to bring us back to the graph that I just showed a minute ago, which actually shows that 16.7% of the GHG emissions in Washington state are from electricity. So it's not inherently clean, which is why electrification in and of itself is insufficient and can be problematic. So I want to urge you to think about what it would mean to bring an equity lens to climate interventions and investments. These are some of the high-level questions we want to ask ourselves if we want to address racial inequities in this sector. Who has been most impacted by climate change, who benefits, and who is left behind by certain interventions. So I will run through this really quick. You've heard about this definitely in several presentations about who is most impacted. This is some research from a partner of ours, Front and Centered, who talks about how people of color, indigenous peoples, and people with lower incomes face greater risks from climate change. And that when so we want to take that and think about when we're exploring interventions or mitigation, we're thinking about, are we doing the most we can to address the underlying vulnerabilities these communities face? Are we reducing their exposures to hazards, or are we giving them resources to cope? So just to kind of play a little case study on that, if we think about who benefits and who's left behind in electrification, and I'm thinking, sometimes we offer tax benefits or incentives or refunds for people to buy electric cars. So this has been done in a lot of places, and we've typically found that these benefit the more wealthy folks in the area. California has done similar things, and our partners at Greenlining have found that a majority of the purchasers using that incentive have incomes of over $150,000. And at one point in that program, over 60% of those incentives were going to Teslas. So who is benefiting from that government-funded incentive? It's the people that are buying these Teslas, and obviously the private companies that are building them. And who's left behind? We should ask ourselves, what aren't we funding when we fund car infrastructure? As I mentioned before, we might find that electric vehicle infrastructure furthers gentrification, and it doesn't actually reduce local air pollution in impacted neighborhoods. We have to think about the GHG emissions that come from the manufacturing of new cars and new roads and parking infrastructure that supports those cars. All of those have emissions and safety and other environmental and social impacts. If on the other hand, we look at something like transit and sidewalks, which is transferring people from fossil fuel burning vehicles to either completely carbon-free modes or more efficient modes. There's a study from the American Public Transportation Association that shows a majority of people of color are disproportionately transit riders, and so stand to benefit when we make it more convenient. Transit and sidewalk investments also bring co-benefits such as good jobs, building and driving transit, improved safety on the road, and reduced costs of auto ownership for those who are able to switch. In terms of who is negatively impacted when we improve transit service, if we are using an equity lens to improve transit service in low-income areas, we may find that there's political backlash from richer areas that feel like they're losing. So the problem really trying to drive home is often the outcomes we are measuring when we look at climate interventions look only at GHG emissions in a silo, and I'm urging us to think broader. Here are some of the policy goals that our Clean and Just Transportation Coalition tries to hold at the same time. We need not only investments that target each one of these categories, whether that's electrification, stormwater retrofits, better zoning, more trees and greening, but we need to focus on investments that help meet the most policy goals at the same time. things that reduce GHG emissions while at the same time improving mobility and access, reducing stormwater runoff, avoiding sprawl, and improving local air quality. By holding all these goals together, we'll get the most bang for our buck while avoiding unintended consequences in other areas. So I spent the last few slides trying to convince you that we can reduce climate harm and tackle climate-related inequities if we take a holistic view at the kinds of transportation investments we're making. But now I'm going to argue that not only can that the right kind of climate investments help address inequities, and we need to tackle structural racism and inequities to even make progress in climate work. Sorry, I read my sentence wrong and that came out funny. So a lot of the investments that have the greatest co-benefits are those that give people more sustainable choices. So in essence, we're asking folks to be able to shift to more climate-friendly modes. But what I want to emphasize is that even if we choose the right investments, if we want people to make changes in their transportation habits and make good choices, we need to address underlying racism that makes those choices impossible, unsafe, uncomfortable, expensive, or inaccessible for certain populations. And so we need to acknowledge historical and current transportation racism to understand why that's so difficult. So just to make sure we're on the same page about what equity is, I'm sure you're familiar with at least one of these graphics. I'm going to oversimplify, but I'm going to define equity as getting people what they need to reach certain goals or outcomes based on their different circumstances. But just equity isn't enough. We need to lead with racial equity because we recognize that the creation and perpetuation of racial inequities has been baked into government, and that racial inequities across all indicators for success are deep and pervasive. And so when I said different circumstances, that was putting it nicely. We're talking about structural and institutional racism, which we need to acknowledge and understand to get at why people are starting from different places. If we don't explore what caused the problems, it's hard to know how to fix them. So we're taking that metaphor and breaking it down a little bit. We want to understand the goals we're trying to meet. In other words, the desired outcomes, all those policy goals I showed you on the previous diagram. Good jobs, lower emissions, good health, safety from injury, harassment, and now COVID. And then we have to look at the context. Again, that's why are people in these quote unquote different circumstances to begin with. Whether that's white privilege, people give me the benefit of the doubt, I've got access to capital, inherited wealth, people in planning look like me. All of the things that give people a jump start. And then we want to look at things that are giving people the opposite of a jump start. Historical laws with lasting impacts and some current day issues, whether that's racism and discrimination, redlining, as someone mentioned, lack of investment in safe infrastructure like sidewalks, bike lanes, transit service in lower-income areas or disenfranchised areas that don't have the political capital to get the investments that they need. These are some of the things that we're going to have to address to get folks to the outcomes that we were just looking at. So what kind of investments do we want to make to address some of those barriers and to get at those outcomes? You'll see the first half of the list is the kind of transportation improvements we listed earlier. Pretty straightforward. Transit, electric buses, affordability programs, safe biking and walking networks. But the second half of the list tries to get more specifically at how equity plays out in the process. How do we make decisions and prioritize investments and get community members to the table? How do we tackle larger structural issues such as policing and their role in transportation accessibility? How do we make sure that the above investments are usable? So now I'm going to talk about some of the recommendations our organization, our coalition have made. In short, they are invest more in sustainable modes, develop and use holistic policy goals, not just GHG emissions in a silo, and then guide revenue choices and investment choices with these goals. And then finally, use racial equity to guide engagement, decision-making, and prioritization. So
We've got 1 minute.
okay, well, This transportation funding system is broken. You can see on the left, this is how people are getting around now, driving, one of the least good modes for climate change. And then you can see how we're spending our money. Over half of it is spent on highways. And one of the issues there is that funding is really restricted to highways. Gas tax can't be spent on multimodal infrastructure. So we've got policy goals embedded in the state code, but they could be better. They don't really address climate change or environmental justice or equity very well, and they aren't used for decision making. When we fund a big transportation package, we don't tie it or say that those investments need to meet these goals. So that's why we ran the Transportation for All bill, which you can read about on your own time. And then you can also check out the revenue recommendations and the investment recommendations that our group came up with. And these are revenue sources that are intended to actually further our goals as well, whether that's making sure they are flexible funds, they're progressive, they're not burdening low-income families, and more. And then here's a slide on our investment recommendations. Again, it talks about transit, walking and biking. Read more about it later. And then just want to say, you know, the process, building equity into the process is probably the most important part, whether that's engagement, having resourced equity advisory bodies to help guide decision making, understanding where the gaps in service and outcomes are across race and income, and then figuring out how to build a system where you invest based on those needs. You might say this is out of our scope. We're just here to talk about climate change, and I'm going to argue again that you can't tackle climate change without centering equity. And so there's some data and resources that you can check out for this. And thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. Thanks so much for being here, Hester. And with that, we are going to go right into our question and answer period. And folks, I know I've been staring at a screen for a couple hours. You all have too. If you need to blink, I was realizing I wasn't blinking as much. So if you need to blink, if you need to stand up again, stretch out, we've got some great questions. And the first one is for Dr. Snover. And this is a combined question from Sue from Medical Lake and Chris from Linwood. How did they measure CO2 800,000 years ago? Oh, and actually, before we get started, to the responders to the questions, please be as concise as possible. So we've got a lot of great questions that we'd like to get through. So concise, short answers would be greatly appreciated for this Q&A. And then for those questions that we don't get to, a reminder to the Assembly members that we'll be sending this list of questions out to the presenters from tonight. And we will be asking for their written responses to the questions we don't get to. And Mike, was there anything else that I didn't cover that we wanted to cover before we dive into questions?
Nope, that's it. Thank you, Gretchen. Okay,
great. So combined question from Sue from Medical Lake and Chris from Linwood about the measuring CO2 800,000 years ago and how accurate were the tools used to measure the temperature and gather data, for example, in the 1900 to 1940 timeframe.
I can start with that one. That's a super important question. So temperatures were measured a very long time ago in that graph that I showed you by a method which involves looking at the oxygen that is trapped within ice cores and the chemical evidence of the global temperature that is within the air. Actually, I should have said air, not oxygen, trapped within ice cores. So ice cores in Greenland and Antarctica accumulate every year, and they lay down rings that can be counted like tree rings, and they can be dated chemically, and they extract the oxygen from within them. That's really technical to that one, but there's always lots of questions about the past temperature records, and there's lots of different ways that people have checked them. And one of the most compelling ways is that they're all different kinds of records that we have. We have direct measurements from thermometers, we have measurements from tree rings that tell us about the past temperature, we have measurements from ice cores, and there's a long, long list of other natural systems that lay down permanent temperature records, and they all are cross-checked and compared to each other. So what I show for a temperature record is a super robust kind of combination of all of those different ways of measuring.
Great, thank you so much, Dr. Snover. The next question is for Dr. Morrison from Zach from Bothell. What responsibility are educators taking for the increase in climate anxiety and climate depression in the children and teens exposed to hyperbolic climate change presentations?
Yeah, that's a great question. So climate change, sort of grief as youth experience it, is something that happens to all. It's actually a little bit of a privileged position to say that we shouldn't teach about climate change, so it is something we do have to address. Many teachers are seeking incredible amounts of professional learning on their own dime without much support, often, to think about solutions and action-centered learning structures, but we really need to do a better job, state level, district level, to be able to fund and support teachers in engaging in this work. It is something that they need to do, but they need support to do it, and that's our responsibility to find that.
Great, thank you. The next question is for Dr. Yibi from Jason in Seattle. Will the remedies to climate change be worse than the disease? Will it drive more people into poverty with higher costs?
Thank you for the question. An issue I did not go into is when you look at the health benefits of mitigation. We heard a lot about transportation. You get people out walking and biking instead of driving. That reduces blood pressure, reduces your weight. It prevents hospitalizations. It prevents avoidable premature mortality. When you think about reducing emissions from coal-fired power plants, also very strong benefit for our health. Around the world, there's 7 million people who die every year needlessly from air pollution. And you start adding up all of those benefits. In fact, those benefits in total are about the same as the cost of mitigation. If we would mitigate, we would reduce our healthcare costs, we would make our lives healthier, the lives of our family healthier, and overall there'd be very big benefits for our health.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that response. The next question is from Pedro from Birch Bay. And this is a question for Claire, Dr. Richards. Native people use fire to lower the risk of wildfires and to manage the flora, favoring trees and plants that benefits them and the animals they preferred. Is it possible using technology, and then in parentheses, fire experts using supercomputer aided by experts in modeling, to use fire as a tool to prevent wildfires? And has anybody looked in to see if it would be effective to help with help of the federal government?
I actually wonder if Dr. Snover would be a better person to answer that question.
Okay.
I'd be happy to take that one on. So, although I wasn't listening carefully enough to know I captured all of it. Can you just give me the gist again? I did hear it, but.
Yes, it just went away from my screen as well. Mike, do you still have that question?
Oh, I see it. I see it in the chat. Okay, you don't need to read it to me. Okay.
I found it.
So yes, so basically, is it possible to use fire as a tool to prevent wildfires? So kind of. So the first answer is that wildfires happen, and wildfires are a natural part of the ecosystem. And there's lightning and there's wildfires, and that's going to happen. So we will never, there's nothing we can do to prevent all wildfires. And wildfires are part of a healthy ecosystem. Of course, wildfires are dangerous, and we don't want them all to happen at all times and in such destructive ways. And so the question is it possible to use fire as a tool for preventing those very destructive fires? And yes, there's a lot of really interesting research about that. So first of all, there are ways to thin and then prescribe burn the landscape to basically reduce the chance of very high, they call them stand replacing, like fires that kill all the trees and travel across the crowns. There are also really interesting findings that say that where you do that on the landscape can make a difference. So, and I'm not a fire ecologist, so I can't tell you if it's like uphill or downhill or north facing or south facing, but there's specific ways that you can use fire to essentially like punch holes in the fabric of fuels that otherwise would spread. So yes, it's possible to use fire to reduce the consequences of really high risk, terrible fires. It is not possible to rid us of all fires because they are a natural component of the ecosystems.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Dr. Snover. The next question is for Hester, and it's a combined question from Lenwell from Camino Island and Russell from Yelm. Should Washington reinstate emissions testing to mitigate transportation pollution? And if emissions testing is reinstated, how will we ensure that it does not cause financial discrimination? For example, the rich can afford newer cars, lower income cannot, and now their cars fail the emissions tests.
That's a great question. That's not something that we've worked on or have a policy position on, but I think that that's the kind of thinking that I really appreciate, where we're saying, okay, like this is one intervention we can use, but what are the unintended consequences on what happens if you fail emissions? Right now, we're working on some legislation that halts the automatic suspension of driver's licenses because there's all these, for inability to pay, because there's all these mobility impacts that make it harder and harder for people to get their daily life, chores done and get to their work. And so again, we actually haven't talked about that much at my organization, but so I'm really skirting the question, but I think thinking through who would be impacted and what are the consequences of failing your emissions and how can we make sure that they don't have a disproportionate impact on people who can't afford to pay is exactly the kind of question we should be asking.
Great, thank you. The next question is for Claire, Sue from Medical Lake. Some power companies have a list of at-risk residents. Do they take this into consideration when creating a blackout?
So that is a great question. I actually called my own utility company today because I couldn't find anything about where our list was. And they said that, basically what we do know is that those lists of vulnerable clients that they keep are out of date because people move. The individuals themselves have to sign up for them. And they are usually an underestimate. And I also asked them, like, hey, how do you use that information? And this is so funny you asked this because I actually called them up myself, because it's utility companies are private companies. It's not like they don't all post everything and you really have to dig to find information. But they told me that they don't actually look at individuals who are on the list when they even turn the power back on. Like, they don't prioritize them. They prioritize hospitals and first responders. And then they prioritize like the largest number of people that they can like get back to power. So, and I think that utility companies each utility company provides a different kind of support to individuals who have energy needs, energy dependence. And mostly it's just like letting them know. And some companies may provide more support than others. I don't think there's any kind of standardization or requirements for what, I'm going to start getting into areas I don't fully understand, but it also represents how cloudy it is for even myself as I'm trying to understand what utility companies do, that I don't have a very clear answer because it's not just out there online.
Thank you so much. And I just want to, again, thank each of the presenters for being with us tonight. And we have a lot of additional great questions that we have in writing and that we've been capturing from the chat that we'll be sending out to each of these presenters for a written response. And we will share that with each of you all, Assembly members, as soon as we get responses back. And we are going to move into our final agenda item, and we're calling it Around the Campfire. And this is something that we are going to save the last few minutes of every meeting for just informal reflections, anything that you want to share. You'll be joined by the same group of assembly members at each of the breakouts. So at the end of each session, the same group of people will gather throughout the duration of the assembly to continue to foster online community, since we are doing this remotely. And with that, let me know, Emily, when we're ready to go into our breakout rooms. You'll also have the same facilitator each time, but no agenda. It's just a time, if you have something you want to share or a reflection you want to share, to please share it with us. Let me know, Emily, when you're ready.
Thanks, Gretchen. How many minutes should I plan for this?
We're gonna do, this is a tester, so we're gonna do 4 minutes before we reconvene for final next steps.
Okay, sounds good. All right, you will be going into breakout rooms now.
Great, thanks, Emily.
I'm gonna head out. Thank you all.
Esther.
Emily, just to let you know, the main room is live stream. So if you want to turn your camera off, you can.
Great. Welcome everyone back to the main room.
Absolutely.
Excellent. Welcome back, everybody. I know that was just a sliver and a lot of great reflections that were shared, and I'm sure kind of across each of the breakout rooms. My golden rule of facilitation, we are going to end on time. Thank you all so much for being here tonight, recognizing you have full days before you get here on Tuesday nights. Our next learning session is on Saturday, the 23rd. And please take a moment to go, if you can put that link in the chat for the feedback for tonight's session. If somebody can do that really quickly. On the 23rd, environment and climate mitigation is what we'll be covering. Have a wonderful night. Have a great rest of your week. And thank you all so much for your active participation in the meeting.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Perfect. Go Zach.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you.